Thank you so much for coming. We were wondering, actually, if there was going to be any interest in business and compassion. And I'm glad to say that there's really been an overwhelmingly positive response. And we're really very blessed by the fact that we have some incredible speakers to share with you today. Individuals from the academic business world, from psychology, neurology, neuroscience, and that whole area, if you will, as well as a number of business leaders who, by their actions, have brought compassion to their organizations and have become advocates for this whole area. My name is Jim Doty, for those of you who may not know. I'm the founder and director of Seagate here at Stanford, which is within the Neuroscience Institute and part of the School of Medicine. Seagate stands for the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, which is an organization whose interest and mission is to really understand the neurobasis of compassion and altruism and create techniques to actually potentiate those behaviors in individuals. And why would that be important? It turns out, and I think on an intuitive level, all of you know, that caring for others, connecting with others, is really what defines our humanity. And in fact, our evolution has resulted in us being at our best when we're actually connecting and being kind. And this, in fact, leads us to our conversation today in terms of how not being that way or not having this type of behavioral characteristic can so negatively impact individuals and actually businesses quite severely. As an example, we know that if you will, the result of not being compassionate is actually fear and anxiety. And so many people spend a great part of their lives in the workplace. Yet, for many of those people, that's a place where they have the greatest fear and anxiety. And there are some managers, some organizations which feel that by creating an organization of which these attributes are present, this somehow results in really getting the best out of an employee. And I think perhaps on the short term, that may be the case. But on the long term, we have example after example that that's not an effective strategy. And in fact, if we look at our evolution as a species and the work of Darwin, many of you hear this comment, geez, it's survival of the fittest and the most ruthless. And in fact, that really is not what Darwin said. That's what an economist who interpreted what Darwin, I say it's usually a banker, but what he really said, it's survival of the kindest or most sympathetic that survives. And there's a number of works now that demonstrate that, in fact, again, short-term results can benefit by ruthless behavior, but long-term survival, and I believe long-term survival of our species, is going to be those who are most compassionate. Whether we look in terms of cost to businesses overall, which some estimate are between $150 to $300 billion in lost productivity and profits secondary to anxiety and fear in the workplace, whether we look at the extraordinary cost in terms of increased costs of health care, which are already expensive for individuals who are suffering from anxiety and fear in the workplace, whether we look at actually the cost of turnover. You know, when 52% of people in their jobs today sit there and say, you know, I've thought of either quitting, changing jobs, or not accepting a promotion because I'm unhappy here. The costs are huge. So this is really, I think, a topic which right now is very germane, and I think as we see and what you will hear from many of our speakers, it is now being recognized as a critical topic in terms of thriving in organization and thriving as individuals. And how do individuals thrive? Individuals thrive, and whether it's in the workplace or in their daily lives, by having decreased fear or being in a place where they feel safe, having a sense, and it's certainly recognized that none of us really have true control, but at least having a sense of control about what you're doing in your life is very important. Having a sense that the work you're doing is meaningful, that the mission means something, that you're respected in your job, and that the actions you do in your job are going to contribute something that's beyond yourself. So all of these are important parts of thriving as humans, and certainly I think we now recognize for businesses to thrive. We're going to basically have 4 panels, is that right? The 4 panels today, the last of which is a panel with business leaders. The first panel is going to sort of talk about the bottom line in terms of how these types of, let's say, not being a compassionate organization affects the bottom line. And the way this is going to work is there are going to be speakers, there's going to be a moderator who'll ask questions, and I believe we'll have some questions from the audience. So the first one is essentially about how organizations, the cost of not being compassionate with an organization. The second part is how organizations are structured in terms of creating a compassionate organization. And then the last panel will really talk about, from a top-down and a bottom-up approach, how individuals can affect the organizations of which they're involved. And then the last panel will be with business leaders who will give an overview of how recognizing, if you will, how fear and anxiety creates a very negative environment, what they have done themselves and how they have reacted to this in their own lives and in the context of their businesses. Our first speaker today is a good friend and supporter of our work here at Seagate. Steve Luczo is the chairman, CEO of Seagate Technologies, which is the largest hard drive manufacturer in the world. They employ tens of thousands of individuals. And this organization, as you'll learn from Steve, is actually quite incredible because early on, before, if you will, CSR was fashionable and really looking at these issues of workplace benefit and how to set up workplaces, they've really been on the leading edge of this. And as a result, Steve has many insights, I think, that we'll all learn from in terms of how Seagate functions and his own view of what it costs, if you will, to have a non-compassionate organization and the great benefit of having a compassionate organization. And without further ado, my friend Steve Luczo. Thanks, Jim.
It's good to see Jim in a tie. I don't know how we work in the slides here. I didn't get any training. Sorry. I may be a tech guy, but I don't know what these things are. While Emma's working that, I decided I had this thing to show everyone, and I was going to do it halfway through my speech, but then I realized that would be tell and show, and show and tell was a lot more fun in kindergarten. So what this is, this is one of, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Sure. Being from Chicago, big rooms are no problem. This is one of 5 of these things in the world. And I just received this last week. I was in Northern Ireland. And what this is this is a signed lead sheet for what was called the Good Friday Agreement. How many of you know what the Good Friday Agreement was, or the Belfast Agreement? This was an agreement that was executed in 1998, which essentially set the dimensions around a peace for Northern Ireland, which had been troubled for a long time. I'm going to talk about Seagate's role in this, but this was presented to me on behalf of the company by John Hume. I don't know how many of you know who John Hume is, but John Hume is a Nobel Peace Laureate. He's also the only living person who has the Gandhi Award and the Martin Luther King Award, as well as the Nobel Peace Prize, which kind of makes me, how His Holiness doesn't have all 3 of those either, but Brian, if you could just put that. And so that's my show, and I want to just explain Seagate's role and why Seagate was, presented this document that has all the signatories of the people who basically spent 10 years trying to negotiate a peace, which has had an unbelievable positive impact on millions of people in Ireland. So just quickly, my goal here is to just propose a few theses at the end, but give a quick overview of a micro view of Seagate, not down to the individual level that Jim was talking about in terms of fear and anxiety in the worst workplace at the individual level, although not that I should debate the person who introduced me. I don't know a lot of companies that optimize fear and anxiety and think that's a good business practice, but we can have a separate panel on that. Most of us have gotten beyond that. But I think what I want to talk about is at the Seagate level, how we engage with the community and why, and then raise it up to a more macro concern, which is why aren't we all doing more to solve some of the real suffering that's going on in the world. And I have a thesis around that that I want to propose that we can then think about and study, and maybe when we all come back together next year we'll have some answers. So Seagate, real quickly, is, for those of you who don't know, it's a lot of things to a lot of people, but basically we're a very large manufacturing company that makes very high-tech products that are absolutely critical to the world we live in, because we store all the data and rich content that people need to solve problems, whether or not it's social problems or financial problems or medical problems, or even just entertainment and enjoyment. So basically we make those devices that all those trillions of bits that get created every day have to be put somewhere. So it's a high-tech company, it's a commodity company. We like to think of ourselves as an open-source hardware company, and for today's nomenclature, we're basically the people that make the mobility and cloud infrastructure shifts possible, because if you don't have a place to put all the storage the data that's being shared amongst us all, then you really wouldn't have an internet or a cloud or anywhere for those endpoints to touch. As Jim mentioned, we have 55,000 employees. As you can see, we're spread throughout the world. And again, the only reference point there is just as Jim said, one of the things about businesses, especially multinationals, is we do have the ability to have large impact across the globe just because we have global footprints. And we engage in a wide variety of institutions and organizations beyond our own. So whether or not they're community or governmental or NGOs, we touch lots of different people throughout the world. So you can see Seagate's footprint is pretty extensive. And we do some incredible things. We run about 15 billion parts per quarter through our factories. We're probably really kind of the last great manufacturing company, I'd say, in the United States, but that's so silly because we're a global company. We refer to it in the United States because I'm in the United States, which is kind of funny, but because most of our employees are not in the United States. But it's a deeply integrated manufacturing company, of which there aren't many left in the world today, because most manufacturing companies have outsourced aspects of their manufacturing to other companies. And Seagate is really one of the few companies that still designs all of the parts that goes into its devices and manufactures not just those parts, but actually the machines that make those parts. So it's a highly integrated business. And the reason it's like that is because the tolerances that we have now, unless we were controlling the technology through all those things, we wouldn't be able to do what we can do. For those of you who don't know anything about disk drives, think of a record player, but really small. And the discs are glass that have layers of magnetics on them, and then there's a recording head that flies over that disc, and it basically sends an electronic flux that either changes the magnetic pole to positive or negative, and that's how we basically pack all this data, so it's zeros and ones. But that head is flying at this point about 3 atoms off of the surface of the disc now. And inside of that head, to build that head, which is about as big as a piece of pepper, we have over 1,100 process steps that starts at a wafer level to actually make that head. So, and then even on the media, the number of layers of magnetics is, in some cases, is less than an atom in thickness. So you can think about the science around what happens when you're putting layers of metal next to each other that are, that small, and what's the interaction like. So it's a big integrated company. We run lots of parts through, we feed lots of people, we bus employees, and we take our jobs very seriously in terms of what it means about our connection to the community. So I've been around for 33 years. We've employed at least 500,000 people since 1979. And over the last 20 years, on average, there's been about 50,000 families who have benefited directly from employment at Seagate. So to Jim's point, to the extent that having food on the table or having a house to go to creates fear and anxiety, clearly corporations do a lot to make sure that those anxieties are somewhat put to bed in terms of providing employment. We have a big focus on human rights, as Jim mentioned. Seagate was the first company of scale to go into China. Up until very recently, we were the largest exporter of manufactured products out of China. In fact, one of our plants on its own was #1. Our second plant was #4. Not that long ago, we were the largest employer in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand. As a result, we always kind of had a very high standard around the ethics of who we hired, what the workplace environment was like. And when other organizations finally started to kind of address this on a industry-wide basis through things like EICC is a big electronics industry consortium that makes sure that workplace is up to U.S. standards, or at least much better than where other countries in the world allowed. Seagate was way beyond all that, so we take pride in that. We take pride in our workplace environment in terms of our contract labor policies and our ethics. And these are all very difficult things, not just in the United States, but clearly outside of the United States, where there are different philosophies and standards around it. And we also have always had a long history of promoting with our employees to engage actively in the communities to address local needs, usually focused on at-risk children, but also we get very engaged when there's major disasters. This is just a partial list of some of the organizations that Seagate engages with throughout the world in order to affect a better world for all of us, and in some ways hopefully relieving anxieties around hunger or food or shelter or education or slavery. And then when disaster strikes, again, because of our footprint, the company gets very involved. So of course in the last several years, as many of you probably know, there's been, it seems, an uptick in acts of God. The Thai floods were devastating to that country and to our industry in particular because the supply chains were greatly impacted. But of course the earthquake and tsunami in Japan disrupted millions of people's lives, and as did the Haiti earthquake and Sichuan earthquake. And in fact, there was another earthquake just last week in China. And Seagate basically immediately engages and provides financial assistance as well as human assistance to rebuilding homes or providing engineering resources, or oddly enough, we even made our clean rooms and other technical capabilities available to to companies, and in some cases competitors, in order for people to kind of get their businesses up and running again. So it's just embedded in our culture. And I want to just tell the story behind the Belfast Agreement. So Al Shugart, 22 years ago, asked me to go to Northern Ireland to see if we should put a plant there. And 22 years ago, Northern Ireland was a really scary place. We were protected by guards with Uzis. I was not allowed to leave the hotel at night. Our cars had the hand grenade protectors underneath them. And I met John Hume on that trip, who gave his talk about why we should come to Northern Ireland. And we came back, and Al asked us how it went and what did we think, and we basically laid out the pros and cons of going there. And it wasn't obvious at all that you would go there. There was probably more cons than there were pros, in part because of what I want to talk about in terms of this mispricing of compassion. And because when a company looks at something going wrong, it can pretty much identify what the cost of going wrong is. But when it looks at something going right, it's harder to both assess the probability of going right and measure the benefit of going right. So in our case, we were probably borderline not going to go. And then Al said, okay, thanks for the presentation. I know what we're going to do. You know, we thought he was going to have to think about it for a while. And we said, oh, well, what's that, Al? And he says, well, we're going to build a plant in Northern Ireland. And I said, okay, why is that, Al? And he said, because it's the right thing to do. And he was a really amazing guy and a really insightful guy, and boy, was it the right thing to do. The impact that Seagate has had on the overall transition in Northern Ireland really can't be understated, and that's why I brought this with me, to be presented this from the individual who helped make it happen, and have that be, you know, I'm sure one of the dearest things to his heart, is evidenced of what happens when a company can engage in a community in a positive way. And Derry is a really interesting place. If you walk down the street in Derry and someone knows that you're with Seagate, they'll come up and shake your hands and say, thank you. You know, you basically saved our town and you basically saved our existence. And we employ about 1,300 people. But when you add the indirect benefit of employment there, it reaches about 8,000 people, and that's of about a 50,000 person workforce. So, you know, one in 7 people somehow is touching Seagate. So it just shows you the power that these companies can have, and obviously getting something like this is rewarding for us, and we'll put that on in our lobby. So I want to touch real quickly, and even though the time thing said, I'm watching my time thing, so it says I got 4 minutes. Good thing I have my own data over here. But I think just in terms of today, what I want to kind of get people to think about is, first of all, I'm a real semantics freak, so, you know, I think a lot of times people confuse compassion and loving kindness, and Jim and I talked about this, and he said, well, in this crowd, probably not, and that's great, because compassion really is about obviously reducing suffering, and then we have to, as opposed to doing something nice, but hopefully reducing suffering is doing something nice, at least for that individual or organization. But, and then of course you have to say, what is suffering? And for me, you know, there's certainly basic challenges around hunger, health, shelter, education that I think we could probably get a pretty high correlation that not having those at levels that are optimized can create suffering or fear and anxiety. And then the one big one for me that I'm very close to now is around human trafficking, and especially human trafficking of young, I won't even say women, young girls for sex. So I don't know how many of you are aware today, but there are thousands of girls under the age of 10 who are taken from their homes and brought into prostitution every year. I don't know how many of you know that. So a lot of us know that. How is that possible that we know that and it's still happening? I mean, it is just unbelievable to me to think that we as humanity are allowing that to happen. And there's no cultural reason, there's no business reason, there's no political reasons that we should let that happen, to have little girls taken from their home and in some cases sold by their homes for prostitution. It's just awful. And if there's anything worse than that, I don't know what it would be. And so if we're going to try and make someone's life better, if compassion is reducing suffering, then let's figure out models that make that more obvious for all of us to solve. And why isn't it being solved? And I think it's around this thesis that I'd like us to think about, is I think that compassion is mispriced. So I'm actually a neuropsychologist and an economist by training, so I try and go back to some of the basic things that I was taught here at Stanford. And I think it's mispriced because there's lack of transparency around the cost of the suffering, and I think there's mispricing around the benefit of reducing the suffering. And I think why that is, I think there's a lot of reasons in terms of we actually don't really want to see a lot of suffering. You know, we spend a lot of time in humanity distracting ourselves from actually having to deal with suffering. We do it on an individual basis. When people are dying, we let other people deal with dying. I had the good fortune to be with my mom when she left. But I think it's this imbalance, and so I want to challenge the economist over the next year, and I'll engage with my friends at the business school as well, to start thinking about, is there different ways that we can look at supply and demand curves and marginal benefit and marginal cost curves to get a better pricing of compassion, which will then, I think, allow for a better allocation of resources. I was speaking to Ryan earlier about, well, but do companies, is there any shift in social responsibility being something important to companies? And it's really curious because just in the last couple of weeks, ISS, which is a big institutional shareholder group that decides whether or not you're a good company or a bad company on corporate governance, has recently just shifted. They used to have a thing, if you can believe this, that said that if you spent too much time on saying that you were doing good for the environment or things like that, that usually count against you. Because it kind of, I guess, opened up the possibility for bad governance because the CEO could direct, resources to maybe their pet projects. It's now shifted that if you don't have social responsibility programs in place, that they're going to start counting that against you. So I think there is a big trend that's changing that. So I think one is how do we do the pricing, and if we can do a better job of pricing, we can do a better job of allocation of resources. And the other is I'm a big believer in a thing called connected capitalism, and I'd encourage you all to kind of, do your wiki searches or whatever. But this is a concept that was developed by a friend of mine named Neville Isdell, who is CEO of Coca-Cola Company, which is one of the great companies in leading social change for the better. And it's this idea of aligning companies who are really good at doing things if they've been provided the direction that that's what they're supposed to do, with NGOs and governments and academics who are really good at identifying problems or doing research around causes of problems, and then working collectively to solve these things in a way where the topic is aligned with the strategic goal of the corporation, but you have the oversight of basically NGOs and governments to affect positive change. And I think this is a potential, very powerful concept that business can gravitate to, but we all have a responsibility. I'm going to tell a 30-second story and then get off the stage. But it's easy for people to kind of take shots at companies about why don't they do more. But companies are mostly responding to their shareholders or the marketplace, and we are the marketplace. I funded a company called NAU, which was a all-sustainable clothing company. So every fiber we used was sustainable. We had very high standards about our manufacturing, about our people. As a result, our stuff was a little bit more expensive, but technically it was great. We had all these people out in North Face and Patagonia and Arc'teryx that were behind it. And the company went out of business inside of 2 years because no one wanted to pay an extra $5 for a jacket that cost, $60. And the company was tiny. It wasn't like we needed 10 million people to do that. We only needed like 10,000 people to do that. But my point is, every day, we do things that are inconsistent with what our core beliefs really are about how we want to treat one another. And I think we need to make sure that we understand our own responsibility in becoming part of the solution, because it's the marketplace as well as the shareholders, as well as the governments and the academics that have to work together in order to solve these very real problems. And then let's just start at least with solving the really important ones, like not letting kids get taken from their homes or making sure that people have shelter or food. And then some of the other ones I think will be a little easier to solve. And companies play a big role in it, and most companies actually take it very, very seriously, and we're all trying to do the right thing. So thank you, and I hope at least it got a few things going in your head.